Welcome everyone to the second session of Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy. Thanks to all of you women who are joining us across many time zones around the world. As of this morning, we have registered women from 8 of the 9 nuclear armed countries: the US, Russia, China, Great Britain, France, India, Pakistan, and Israel. And we hold space here for nuclear armed North Korea. We are honored today to have an extraordinary group of mentors with us, all of whom are dedicating their lives to transforming our nuclear legacy. And we're honored to have all of you with us, all of you who were with us in the first session and coming back and maybe bringing your friends, and those of us who are joining us for the first time. Thank you all for joining us to claim your seat at the table, to change our nuclear story, to eliminate nuclear weapons. I want to express my gratitude to the Plowshares Fund Women's Initiative for their generous support in making this project possible. Plowshares has been leading the quest to eliminate nuclear weapons since they got started in the early 80s. And I want to honor Plowshares founder, Sally Lilienthal, who dedicated her heart and her soul and her life to this work. We wouldn't be here without Sally, and we wouldn't be here without Plowshares. Now I want to welcome my dear friend and teacher, beloved elder here on the island of Kauai, Kumu, Hula, Puna, Dawson. Puna shares the spirit of aloha wherever she goes, and she travels the world sharing aloha and building bridges of peace between the peoples of the Hawaiian Islands and the peoples of other countries. I want to welcome you now, Auntie Puna. Mahalo for being here. Aloha. And Puna is going to open our session this morning with a blessing. And so Puna, please, we welcome you to offer your blessing. Mahalo.
Aloha and welcome everyone. I'm so honored to not only be here with you, but to be able to see you and feel your spirit. In Hawaiian thought, the thing that I will share in our language, because language is a breath that continues to affect and bring emotions of truth to the forefront. It says, we have this world. We are blessed by all that we have to be in care for, exactly what all of you are doing. We have the opportunity to take the best of our past, take care of it now in the present, like all of you, to ensure that it's going to be there for the future. So I say it to you in my language of the heart. Po ai ke aloha o ke akuia kako. A po ke kukui o ke akuia kako. Malama ka mana o ke akuia kako. Ke akua ke kia I malu no kako. Mana wahia pau o kako. Ke akua no. Ke akua I loko o hei mana. Aloha.
Mahalo, Auntie Puna. That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing the blessing of aloha this morning for all of us. In our first session, we planted many seeds that will be going on deeper today as we consider why nuclear weapons matter now more than ever. Why? In our first session, we heard that former US Secretary of Defense William Perry says that we're at a greater risk of a nuclear catastrophe today than at any time in history. When asked about what keeps her awake at night, nuclear expert mentor Jessica Slate talked about the risk of an accidental nuclear war due to a false alarm. This is something that Jessica, Secretary Perry, and many of the top nuclear experts are concerned about in the world today. And that's plenty for us to be worried about. But there's more, and as we're going to hear today, the perils of our nuclear legacy are unfolding right here and now in our communities. And it's up to each and every one of us to determine what legacy we're going to leave to our children. Ambassador White, who negotiated the landmark treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, emphasized this when she said to us, history is made by every single step that we take every day. She planted the seed that each and every one of us can make a difference, can change history, can take steps in our daily lives to impact our nuclear legacy. Mentor disarmament specialist Natalia Zhurina shared an example of what this can look like when she told us the story of her barista friend who serves nuclear-themed lattes as a way to start conversations with her customers about the nuclear threat. Who knows, Natalia said, maybe one day a representative of her government will visit her cafe, order a cup of coffee, and this will make them reconsider their nuclear policy. We saw the beauty and power of one person making a difference in filmmaker turned activist Keiko Tamaki's exquisite video song, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, the first song she ever wrote after a visit to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum created with Hawaii artist Makana. And we've just put it in the chat with the link for those of you who haven't heard it. It's truly, truly a beautiful song. We heard from mentor biologist Mary Olson how radiation disproportionately harms women and girls. And we heard from mentor Marjan Nurjan about Kazakhstan's nuclear legacy, and from both Mary and Marjan how nuclear weapons disproportionately impact indigenous peoples and peoples of color. Mentor Kekasham Basu and advisor Aida Akima Skriva shared why we absolutely must engage girls in this work. And Kekasha shared the inspiring ways she connects her work with children and disarmament with all of the other UN Sustainable Development Goals, which brings us around to today's session, why nukes are connected to everything we care about, including climate change. The intersectionality of nuclear weapons and climate change is being felt around the world, especially in locations where nuclear waste is stored. In her video poem, Anointed, Marshallese poet-activist Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner shares the devastating legacy of US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, where the sea keeps rising and the concrete dome that the US built to store the nuclear waste keeps cracking, and where the Marshallese are alarmed and deeply concerned by the radioactive waste that is leaking into the Pacific. I offer this video poem Anointed to you now with deep bows of gratitude to Kathy for us to all share and witness together. Tom, if you could play that right now, that would be great.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless, swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Iroij chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history, immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruit, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Ledao, a piece of her shell anointed with power, a leathery green fragment hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Ledao the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I am looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's a story of another shell, anointed with power. Ledao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Ledao laughed and laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is a story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions, hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
I've watched this piece many times and it's hard for me to follow it with my own words. So I leave us with the words that stay with me each time I watch it. You know, who anointed them with the power to burn? You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? The experience of Kathy's poem touches on a theme we'll be returning to again and again throughout these sessions, which is the power and the importance of art and storytelling to inspire action, to transform our nuclear legacy. And so may it be so. In our first session, we talked about why women and why now. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, women have been at worst completely, or at best largely shut out of nuclear security planning, decision-making, and policy-making. Today, women are still grossly underrepresented in nuclear policymaking, negotiation, and peace-building processes. And yet when women are involved, the research shows peace becomes more possible and peace agreements more enduring. We continue to create ever more deadly weapon systems, and we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy ourselves many, many times over. Today, it is an existential imperative that women come forward to lead, to change our nuclear policy and eliminate nuclear weapons. Excluding women, half of the human race, for most of the nuclear age, has brought us to the brink of possible extinction. Now we're going to hear from the deeply inspiring mentors we have with us today. These women are all changing the game, all leading in new ways, all showing us a pathway forward to peace and disarmament. And these women are welcoming us, inviting us to join them, roll up our sleeves and get this done. And there's not a moment to spare. I want to begin by welcoming Ray Acheson. Ray is the director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, also known as WILF, which brings an intersectional feminist analysis of weapons and war to intergovernmental disarmament processes. Ray represents WILF on the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for working with governments to negotiate and adopt the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. They have an honors BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Toronto and an MA in Politics from the New School for Social Research. Welcome, Ray. Next, I want to introduce Molly. Welcome, Molly. Molly Hurley is a nuclear fellow with the Prospect Hill Foundation and recipient of the Wagner Fellowship, which supports her research on the societal effects of nuclear weapons, youth movement building for nonproliferation, and how art can be used to deliver messages for denuclearization. Also a fellow associate at Beyond the Bomb, Molly volunteers to build their network of activists and foster skills in promoting peace and justice. A tenet of Molly's work is recognizing and respecting the intersectionality of issues and people. Her activism goals are to create opportunities for those who would otherwise be marginalized or excluded. Molly will travel next year to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to further study the impacts of nuclear war. Next, I'd like to introduce Colleen. Colleen, welcome. Colleen Moore is Digital Engagement Manager at Global Zero and Beyond the Bomb, creating content to galvanize support for the mission to eliminate nuclear weapons. Colleen has campaigned for ending US support for the war in Yemen, ending the occupation of Palestine, promoting human rights and justice in Indonesia and East Timor, and peace between North and South Korea. Above all, she has a passion for using digital mediums to advance causes of human rights and justice. She previously worked at Win Without War, Seeds of Peace, East Timor and Indonesia Action Network, and Peace Action New York State. Colleen was an innovation fellow with N Square Innovation Network and volunteers as Senior Program Director for Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Welcome, Beata. Beata Tsosie-Peña is the Environmental Justice Program Coordinator for Tewa Women United. Beata is from Santa Clara Pueblo in El Rito, New Mexico. She is a mother, poet, advocate, seed saver, and certified as an educator in Indigenous sustainable design, permaculture, and many other practices. She is also a Green for All Fellow and a Pueblo representative for the New Mexico Governor's Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. The realities of living next to a nuclear weapons complex have called her into environmental health and justice work with the local nonprofit organization, Tewa Women United, TWU, for over a decade. As part of Beata's work with TWU, she manages the creation of the Española Healing Foods Oasis Demonstration Garden Project. Welcome, Beata. We're going to begin with Molly, and we'll ask each mentor a series of questions and then come back together at the end of the questions for the Q&A. So again, I want to welcome you, Molly. We're so happy that you're here and really excited for you to share your presentation on how nuclear weapons are connected to everything we care about. Please share your work with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so like Cynthia said, my name's Molly. I work with the Prospect Hill Foundation as well as Beyond the Bomb. And I'm a graduate from Rice University. I think the first place to start is how did I even get into this space? And it was pretty serendipitous, actually. I graduated from Rice with a degree in chemistry with a specialization in organic synthesis. So not particularly related to nuclear policies. However, a little over a year ago, I was looking for a way to get more involved in the activist space. And I happened upon this fellowship with Beyond the Bomb. I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I had no idea if I was qualified for this fellowship, and that's a really common theme for all of our applicants. And that's actually totally okay. We almost prefer it that way because, and I'll talk more in depth about the fellowship later. But really, I have Beyond the Bomb to thank for getting me into this space and teaching me just about everything I know. So one of the big things that we like to emphasize at Beyond the Bomb is intersectionality. Intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was particularly to discuss the intersection of two oppressed identities, being Black and being a woman, and how the intersection and the dynamic between these two categories create unique circumstances that would not be experienced by just women or just Black people. And in terms of nuclear weapons, I want to show you how just nuclear issues intersect with all sorts of other issues. And I could talk for hours about all the different issues, but we're gonna just do a quick sample of a few. 1 second. All right, so at Beyond the Bomb, we refer to nuclear issues as issue 0, as in it's almost ground zero, where every single other issue is very closely tied into and connected with this. So the very first one that we're going to start with is talking about violence against women. So there are several points about this, but the first thing I'm going to talk about is the male symbolism around nuclear weapons alone. And I'll just give one very specific example. When Truman was at the Potsdam Conference trying to negotiate a Soviet entrance into World War II, that was the time when the Trinity test, the very first explosion of a nuclear weapon ever, was conducted. And he was in the middle of these meetings. So of course they couldn't just come to Truman with a report of, oh, hey, we successfully detonated a nuclear weapon, or we didn't. They codified this as if the detonation was unsuccessful, they would say it's a girl. And if it was successful, they would say it's a boy. And I think that just reinforces the idea of male superiority. Next, what we can look at is, as Cynthia said, there are virtually no women in the room when it comes to the decision makers of really any policies, but particularly foreign policy. At Beyond the Bomb, we refer to this regime that's kind of been there for a long time, and they don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon, as pale, male, and stale. They're old, they're white, and they're men. Another way we can look at this is there's a lot of might equals right sort of mentality around our military and particularly our nuclear posture. Looking at multilateral diplomacy as a way to negotiate arms control is kind of looked down upon for the most part. It's seen as weak and feminine. And this can be traced all the way back to Truman, really, who had more of a policy that we could term masculine diplomacy, which was very focused on unilateral movement, decision making, and forcing your decisions upon other people through sheer might and will and power. And then if you were able to attend the last webinar, you probably heard from Mary Olson about the radiation effects. But I'll just give a quick recap, just a few bullet points for those of you who are just entering. Radiation does affect women differently from the way it affects men. For example, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese women were twice as likely to develop solid cancers. They had increased rates of stillbirths, miscarriages, premature births, birth defects, and growth disorders, and as well as accelerated menopause. So it's not also just a gendered issue, but it's a generational issue. There's intergenerational trauma that can be passed on from these. Let's see here. We can move on to climate justice. So we can also think about this as violence against our Mother Earth. So this is still a gendered issue as well. I think it kind of goes without saying that nuclear war would be a disaster for the environment. But there was a recent study that was updated in 2019 that looked at the effect of a quote unquote small nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which maybe about 250 nuclear weapons would be used, ranging from what we would call low yield nuclear weapons, so around the size of Hiroshima, a little bit smaller, to larger ones. And they calculated that climate-wise, we would suffer a global nuclear winter for at least 10 years. We could see global temperatures drop. I believe it's about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, and that alone could result in global famines and decrease agricultural production. We can also think about the mining process of uranium used for our atomic bombs. In particular, there are a number of old uranium mines around the Grand Canyon, and for the sake of these weapons of mass destruction, we're tearing into one of the biggest landmarks in our country and destroying and marring some of its natural beauty. And then also there's a ton of nuclear waste and contamination that can come from this. For example, in 1979, there was a Church Rock, New Mexico spill. This was a few months prior to the 3 Mile Island incident. And in fact, the Church Rock, New Mexico spill is considered the largest nuclear contamination event, at least in the country. There was a dam on the Navajo Nation that broke, and it released 94 million gallons of radioactive waste into the Puerco River and surrounding communities. And these communities are still suffering generational effects of this contamination. If we go back to the Grand Canyon, Obama actually put a 20-year ban on uranium mining in 2012, but this is under scrutiny of being thrown out by Trump. Let's see here. In December of 2017, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Obama's ban on uranium mining near the Grand Canyon, but there has been some trouble with a particular group called the Havasupai tribe, where there are just some technical things where a mining company is claiming that they can open and continue their mining process, and the Havasupai tribe has been taking this to court, and it's been getting denied and then given life again for the hopes of going through and blocking this mining, and I believe this is still going through the system. And talking about the Navajo Nation, this brings us to systemic racism. So it sounds like, again, if you were at the previous webinar, you may have had the privilege to hear a little bit about this already. But I think if we just think about the communities who have been directly affected by our nuclear system, such as the Navajo Nation from uranium mining, the Marshallese from nuclear testing, the Congolese, in French-controlled Congo at the time for mining uranium for our very first nuclear weapons in America, as well as the Japanese and other Asians and people of color. All of these people of color have suffered the most under our nuclear history, as opposed to more privileged white or European peoples who do not live directly in these communities that have suffered contamination or did not experience the detonation of a bomb on their cities. The most marginalized communities are the most susceptible to the effects of a nuclear winter. If we think about the global famine that could come from a nuclear winter, the upper class will have the money to still buy food for them at these increased prices. That is definitely going to happen if there's a famine. But then our poorer communities are the ones that are going to be most effective. And if we also keep in mind people of color are the most at risk or are disproportionately in the bottom percentage of income. And then next, I want to just look at New Mexico as a case study. So New Mexico's poverty rate juxtaposed to Los Alamos within New Mexico, where there is a big nuclear laboratory. New Mexico ranks 49th in the entire country for poverty. They are and 50th for child poverty. They have some of the worst poverty rates in the entire country. And yet, if we look at Los Alamos, that area has the highest percentage of millionaires in the entire country. So there's a common argument for anything military, but the nuclear industrial complex as well, that this area produces jobs. But we really have to look at who is getting these jobs, these higher paying jobs. And that's generally going to be higher educated white people, whereas in the Los Alamos laboratories, the staff of color are primarily on the level of janitor or something like that. And now let's look at something that's probably most relevant to us right now, which is the pandemic, how we're dealing with this and how this intersects with our nuclear arsenal. Well, first of all, we can just look at how much money we're spending on our nuclear arsenal. Over a 30-year period, we are set to spend $1.7 trillion just upgrading and modernizing our nuclear arsenal. The Physicians for Social Responsibility had a tweet a few months ago that said Trump wants to spend $45 billion on nuclear weapons. I think that's within a single year. So how many masks could that amount of money buy? That is 3 billion face masks or 45 million COVID tests. From Global Zero, they looked at the cost of maintaining just one nuclear weapon for 1 year, and that alone could give 36,000 low-income Americans healthcare. And we have over 6,000 nuclear weapons if you include the retired ones as well. Let's see here. Previously, with the CARES Act, we sent $10.5 billion to the Department of Defense, and we may even send another $7 billion for weapons programs alone, which is part of a total $29 billion for defense spending overall. And then, of course, there's tons of overspending in our projects. There's such a double standard. We always have plenty of money for new military projects and for this nuclear modernization program, but there's never enough money to take care of human lives through welfare or health insurance, or even just providing masks and COVID tests to our general population. So in summary, I'm pretty young, so how does this affect me personally? Well, the research I'm doing is helping me understand how to get the word out about these issues and what we can do about it. This is extremely relevant to me because our future, not just with climate change and this pandemic, and whether or not we go to nuclear war and we suffer a nuclear winter, is going to affect my generation in the long term much more than the old people who are making all these decisions right now. Anyways, my last slide is just some of the artwork that I've made personally through my project with the Prospect Hill Foundation and to help with promotion of Beyond the Bomb. On the left, this is a piece that I painted in honor of the 75th anniversary of Nagasaki and Hiroshima earlier this year. And on the right is a cultural analysis of the influence of the nuclear age in America on the left and in Japan on the right. But that is it for my presentation for now. So I will turn it back over to Cynthia.
Molly, thank you. That was great. The way you bring it all together. And, I just have to say that having come of age on this issue in the 1980s, where we were just focused on one issue and we didn't connect it with everything else, you all are so far ahead of us now. And, really so much gratitude to you for embracing this issue and taking it on, and also expressing it through your art. That's just really another beautiful way as we keep coming back to inspiring people to wake up and act and change. So I'd like to ask you one follow-up question, which is if you could let everyone here on the call know about if they want to get involved with a fellowship opportunity with Beyond the Bomb, or with you and collaborate with you in your work. We're really building and weaving connections here for all of us. So please share what people can do and how they can connect with you.
Yes, so I can give a few more specifics on the fellowship. Our next round of applications actually will be opening next month. But to give you an idea of what our fellows do specifically, first of all, we introduce you to the idea of nuclear weapons and kind of what's going on in the nuclear space right now. What do we need to know? And why is this issue urgent? And as well as talking about the intersectionality of this issue. And once you kind of get your bearings in that, we also focus on how to be an activist in this space. So we have weekly webinars to train you on various things. In particular, we'll talk about writing letters to the editors, to your newspapers, and possibly even an op-ed. We teach you about how to make graphics, whether it's a meme or just a really pretty graphic that has the quote or whatever you want to say on it that can help get our message out there. We have a blog that our fellows can write for, where they can write about a topic and how it intersects with nuclear weapons. So I've had a fellow who wrote about how the movie Cabin in the Woods is related to nuclear weapons. I've had a fellow who wrote about the history of nuclear farming, in which they would purposefully radiate their agriculture or whatever, and just to get mutant varieties and see what came about. In addition, we can talk about lobby meetings. In the time of COVID, a lot of representatives are actually doing virtual lobby meetings, so we may have a training on that. In the past, before COVID, we also talked about bird dogging, in which you go up to a candidate and you just kind of annoy them about the issue. You'd be like, hey, what do you think about no first use? Will you support it? I actually got to bird dog Julian Castro while he was still running for president. I was very nervous, but I think it went pretty well. And we're also just going to talk about how to build a story, how to build a narrative that is going to draw people in even more, as opposed to just saying nuclear weapons are going to end the world. That's a little scary, and it doesn't give anyone hope that there are actions that we can take that can prevent the end of the world. And aside from our fellowship, we have campaigns going all the time. If you sign up for our emails, you can keep updated on that, whether it's a Write Your Representative campaign, or we're actually going to be starting a postcard campaign soon, where we send out a postcard to you and you can write a postcard to your representative, asking them to endorse no first use or say nuclear policy. In February, we have a campaign called Make Love, Not War. And we haven't worked out the details of what we're doing for that quite yet. And really exciting is that actually we're having a webinar that's going to be approximately quarterly. And that's going to be open to the public. We're going to talk about the intersectionality of nuclear weapons with a very, very specific issue. Our first one will be next month. And so we're probably going to be looking at, okay, we have a new president, hopefully. what's next? So those are some very specific things with our organization that you can do. I can also drop my contact info in the chat if you're interested in contacting me directly. I'm happy to discuss anything.
Thank you so much, Molly, for illuminating us on all you're doing and sharing all those opportunities. And your contact is also on our mentor page on the website. So we'll be putting that into the chat later in the session. And so we encourage all of you who are interested in collaborating with Molly and Beyond the Bomb to be in touch with her and follow up. So thank you. This is absolutely really inspiring. Thanks for all you're doing, Molly. Beata, I'd like to come to you next and welcome you again and just say that we're so deeply honored to have you with us and so grateful for all you're doing every day to work on transforming our nuclear legacy. Welcome again. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to start with a question for you that really touches on you and your life, which is that today most people think that the nuclear threat and the nuclear legacy are historical things of the past. You live about 20 minutes downwind from Los Alamos National Laboratory. You're a mother of 2 children, a poet, an activist. You live every day with a nuclear legacy, both historical and current. If you could please share your story about the impact nuclear weapons have had on you and your family, your community at the Pueblo, the wider community of New Mexico, and the environment, we would be really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel alongside so many wonderful advocates and activists and elders. I know a lot of you have been doing this work for your life. That things could change, you know, that we could transform this culture of violence. And just want to say thank you to Molly for that overview. It's really refreshing to hear those things being said, and I'm not sharing already. So again, I'm here in my homelands. I'm in Santa Clara Pueblo, which is about 20 minutes downwind from Los Alamos National Laboratories. And I'm going to go ahead and share a picture of, so you can kind of, some of you that aren't familiar with New Mexico, where we are. We must protect those most vulnerable. Navatoijia is land worker mother. We protect us all. We all come through water as a environment. In one pregnancy, 3 generations are held as one. Intergenerational health is dependent on the health of our homelands. And so here you can see our river, Pozongue, also known as Rio Grande. And behind in the background is one of our special sites called Black Mesa. And I'm actually in the, do have 3 children. This is when I was pregnant with my son, who is now 7. And, you know, as what I bring this up of Navatoijia as being the center for protections when it comes to any kind of toxic industry, any kind of regulation, when we consider environmental impacts. Because of what Molly already talked about of the vulnerability of women, of infants, of our elders, we know that, yeah, just in one pregnancy, the impacts on our reproductive justice. And so anything that that baby is exposed to in utero is going to impact their reproductive health right off the bat. And so that's what we mean when we say 3 generations are held as one. And this is based off of the work of Mohawk midwife Gudgie Cook and building off of that. And so we know that a lot of the toxins coming from nuclear production are some of the only ones that can cross placental boundaries. So Right now, we're dealing with the threat of a release of tritiated water vapors up at the waste dump in Los Alamos, Area G. And this is the issue we've been fighting this whole year during the course of this pandemic. And we're really asking for a public outcry to not take the cheapest option. When thinking about the massive amounts of money that come through these laboratories, I think 17 trillion has passed through Los Alamos alone since its beginning. There's no reason that any kind of release should be in our open air. And so this is something we're facing right now that we have a lot of concern about. And so I just want you all to center Indigenous peoples, center Indigenous pregnant families as we go about this work moving forward. A culture of violence has desecrated sacred sites with nuclear waste. This avenue to now be armed guards and razor wire. Nuclear weapons also produce waste that kills, next door to the spiritual, cultural, and physical lifeways of the first peoples of this place. We have only one water source here. So this is a picture of Area G, the nuclear waste dump that's up on top of our watershed and the Pajarito Plateau, which is part of the Jemez mountain range, which is the western part of ancestral Tewa territories. And oldest ancestral sites where this waste dump is. And if you see those big white tents, those are barrels of mixed radioactive waste above ground. There's also about 30,000 barrels below ground and unlined pits. Example of that and that really moving columns. And some of our oldest kivas, if you don't know what a kiva is, it's our place of prayer, it's a place of learning, really special ceremonial place for our peoples. And some of the oldest ones in existence were up on this mesa, and I'm sure to them it was just a hole in the ground to put waste in. It was a convenience, and so this ongoing desecration of our ancestral places, which to us are still living, they're still alive. We still very much have relations with these places, and we're not going to abandon them to these industries. The Pacific Ocean poisoned by nuclear catastrophe. There is the same threat to our waters from local laboratories and industries. Next to our Rio Grande, PCBs and chemicals continue to migrate. A mile-long hexavalent chromium plume is contaminating Pueblo lands. There are 21,000 oil and gas wells in Rio Arriba County alone, and sacred sites like Chaco are fracking zones. So again, about water, as our this notice now of the barrels of liquid waste to Fukushima are going to be released. There's already been something around the lines of like 10,000 gallons a day that have been leaking into the ocean since that happened for years now. And so it's not just radionuclides that we're dealing with as a downwind or downstream community. We're dealing with hundreds of different kinds of chemicals. We're dealing with pollution in our aquifer, hundreds of contaminated sites. And they all get cleaned up to this standard that is not protective of Indigenous pregnant families. They're protective of an adult white male. And this is where more of the systemic scientific racism comes in, to where even cleanup standards are based on that adult white male. So I know that the federal standards of protection, the state standards of protection do not protect myself and my family, who still live off the land, who still hunt, fish, gather the plant medicines, gather clay for our dishes, harvest rainwater, our agricultural ranchers, I could go on and on about our land-based traditions, but you know, these aren't considered when determining how much toxicity can be released into the environment. So that's more of the environmental racism. And this is a picture of the garden project I've been working on for the last 5 years. We must put back what has been taken, reclaiming reciprocal relations, look to indigenous technologies of dry land, desert, resistance and resiliency, clean environments and heirloom seeds, ensure our return to values where nothing is wasted and you only take what you need. And so this is, the whole garden is based off of Tewa ancient garden techniques of rainwater harvesting and dryland farming, which we did learn how to live sustainably in a desert ecosystem over time. We're fortunate as Tewa peoples to still be in our ancestral homelands. We were not forcefully displaced or relocated. But you know, we have these beautiful examples of these gardens up in our watersheds, up in our mountains, and they're still working. They're still harvesting this rainwater to get that extra little bit down in the valley to grow food and medicine. And so that's what we're doing at this site. And so this picture is after a rain event, showing just how much water you can catch with these techniques. And so we really believe in a strength-based approach to talking about these issues with our community and giving them really real tools to reconnect and remember these ways of living in harmony and balance and aligning with the values of the indigenous peoples of this place. It is time for a story of abundance. Our corn mothers taught us to love, respect, and take care of one another. And to invoke Dr. Emoto, waters of the world, we are sorry, please forgive us. A culture of peace returns as we enter our gardens with good thoughts, honoring this ancient evolution. And so this is a picture of one of our community garden fields next to the Espanola Farmers Market, where we help to reconnect the ditch system to this piece of property. And we actually had an intern that came and did soil samples one summer. Her study is called Red Dust, a Soil Scientist's Journey, by Morgan Druniani, and she found in the soil in this field. RDX can only come from high explosives. And so we were looking for things that could directly be tied to Los Alamos and their activities. And so when we talk about high explosives, you know, it's not just nuclear weapons that they're producing and maintaining up there. It's also other kinds of weapons. It's bombs, it's bullets, it's smaller, more usable nuclear arsenals. You know, armor-piercing nuclear bullets. It's chemical weapons. It's biological weapons. And in regards to the massive amounts of waste that they don't know what to do with, if there's an old bomb that they say is too dangerous to transport for disposal, the way they dispose of it is through open air detonation up on the top of our mountains. And we hear these booms and these rumblings constantly of when they're doing this. And there was a period of time where it was almost on a daily basis. And that was part of the catalyst for what kind of joined me to get into this work, was experiencing that. And so RDX is from high explosives. It's water soluble and it accumulates in the leafy greens of plants. So knowing that, we chose to plant more fruit-bearing plants in this garden. We partnered with some mycologists and we started burying mycelium pillows in the ditches and in the soil that we know can help to remediate these toxins. And so there is a lot of untapped possibilities of healing and restoring these sites through restoring natural systems to their ultimate health, to clean themselves out, that can clean up these toxins to 0 parts per billion or per million, and not just have these allowable levels of harm that impact us through multiple and cumulative exposures over long periods of time. And that's that more of that intergenerational impacts that was talked about. So we advocate for this, you know, and they haven't listened yet. I think there's a lot that needs to be done to have us at the table to heal these lands that we are a part of as Indigenous and Land peoples in northern New Mexico. And waters of the world, we love you, we thank you. Our pursuits for future generations spiraling back to this moment. We are lost in a lie of linear time. We are born from precious fragility. Cycles of violence will end through remembering what it is to be a spiritual human being, protecting her waters from ever being hurt again. And so this is the baby that was in that first picture. And having that ability to live in love and respect with all of our non-human relations, recognizing that they were here before us in the order of the universe, and that we have to really humble ourselves as humans. We have to really become protectors of these elders that are all around us, and start to even just approach these things in our own lives in a way that is more intentional, more through a lens of advocacy, because we all have to protect our environment no matter what our traditions come from, you know. And I would love to just be a farmer and grow plants and make gardens, but it also comes with, I can't do that unless I have a clean environment, you know, to do that in. So that is this PowerPoint. Maybe I'll leave it here. I think that, you know, I could also talk for hours about the issues and the multiple impacts that we're dealing with on a daily basis, living next to nuclear weapons production. But what I would say today is that we need everyone to step up, to use your privilege, use your whatever voice or means are available to you, to look at how these systems intersect with a lot of the other areas around, you know, militarism and the constant militarization of Native lands that we have to endure as Native peoples. How do we restore Indigenous communities to what they were? Giving these lands back to the care and management and of the first peoples of those lands, because we will work to restore them. We will work to dismantle these systems that harm them, and not being afraid of building those kinds of relations of honoring those rights of just even the original treaties, honoring those rights of, like, honestly looking at these, you know, federal ways of taking over and occupying land that is literally destroying the planet on a global level. That is, instead of reparations and healing and restoration for all of the Indigenous peoples of globally who have suffered under nuclear colonialism, that we can start to give these things back and what was taken. You know, it all comes with these original violences of separating the peoples from the land, or the attempt at doing so. And you can't do that. You know, we're part of our ecosystems, we're part of our ecology, and we have to get over this Western colonial mindset that we are separate from our environment, that we can dominate our landscapes and exploit it for profit. You know, abolishing capitalism, abolishing the military economy. It has to be done one way or another. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Beata, I'm going to actually, Ali, I want to ask you just a couple of quick follow-up questions, if I might, if it's okay. But I want to just say that
Sure.
the multiplicity of sources that you described that are current and recent is just staggering and devastating. And the way that you have in your community, the way that you are actually remediating the land and actually doing something to bring your community together and taking action in that place where you live, the way that you're doing it is so inspiring. And so grateful for your sharing and for your courage and your resilience in all that you are bringing to this. If you could, oh, sorry, I'm going to start my video. I wanted to keep it off just to keep you stable, but when you start talking, I'll turn it off again. But I just wanted to ask if you might touch on a couple of things briefly. One that you mentioned, which is the tritium, but I'd like to just hear you speak. You've spoken very eloquently about the legacy of the Trinity test on the people of New Mexico and your community. And if you might just touch on that briefly, so that people can see that you're not only dealing with this multiplicity of current sources, but you have this intergenerational legacy as well. So if you could just touch on that briefly for people who aren't aware of that and what it's been doing. And then secondly, if you could just explain what the current, I know there was an update meeting this week that Los Alamos did on what they're planning to do with the tritium. If you could explain what the current status is and what they're planning to do. And then I just want to ask you how people specifically can be supportive and help you and come together to support your incredible work. So I'm going to turn my video off while you speak, and I encourage other people to do so also to support the stability of Beata's connection.
So I've had a lot of mentors in this movement. One of them is Tina Cordova of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium in southern New Mexico, who's been tirelessly fighting for reparations and healthcare for the communities adjacent to the Trinity test site. And so there is an amendment on the table that we could pressure our congressional delegation to pass, which would amend the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include downwind and downriver communities from nuclear sites. Right now, only workers and miners are eligible for compensation. And so that would really open it up to the peoples of New Mexico. It would require an apology for the first time from the government on what our peoples have had to endure. And I'm hoping it will open the door to what my pueblo and surrounding pueblos adjacent to these labs also endured leading up to the explosion of the first atomic bombing on the people in New Mexico. The first 15 years of these laboratories were completely unregulated. So any waste they were producing was going into our canyons, going into our ecologies, our air, our bodies. We have some of the highest exposure to airborne plutonium as a result of developing Fat Man and Little Boy, which, and the Trinity test in southern New Mexico. We know that plume also reached to where we are and even farther into like Colorado. Some of the cancer rates in New Mexico are up to like 7 to 8 times the national average. So people are holding bake sales to pay for their cancer treatments. We see the illnesses all around us in our communities. We see the high miscarriage rates. And yet there is no healthcare, there's no compensation, there's no acknowledgement, and the burden of proof falls on our communities to prove that harm is happening. So health studies, sampling of our agricultural way of life, it's just like so much that we need, and that's more of the scientific racism where, that burden of proof shouldn't fall on impacted communities who are impoverished and who do not have the resources to address this. And even honoring the government to government relations that the United States has through treaty obligations to surrounding Pueblo nations to be fully informed, you know, about these issues of the past and present day. And we have to just constantly advocate for basic public process and just for that government to government consultation to happen in a meaningful way, you know. And there's no excuse for at least these processes to not happen. And so I think about, you know, how this nuclear legacy is less than 100 years old, and yet our peoples have been here through countless generations. You know, I've seen studies that peoples have been here 30,000 years, you know, in this place, and I have to have a lot of trust in that ancestral energy. And that's why I really like to focus on the food and seed sovereignty, our strengths that have continuously been passed down to our peoples and to our children, despite 3 waves of colonial violence in New Mexico that we're still dealing with and trying to recover from, on top of having to deal with constant environmental violence, which is the way colonialism has taken its form in the present day. And, you know, to get into like some of these present day issues, like we still have a mile wide hexavalent chromium plume in our aquifer. We still have hundreds of contaminated sites. We still can't access our sacred sites to even go and practice our spirituality in our homelands. We still we don't know the impacts of what harm is happening to us through our land-based existence, or with the miscarriages that we see happening in our communities, and the, you know, the health impacts on our babies. And I think with the tritium issue, it's one example of, you know, trying to push through harmful environmental policies in the midst of a pandemic when they know people don't have the capacity to respond, which is just, it's just mind-blowing to me that, and the tribes have been forthcoming that we don't have the capacity to address this right now. You know, and what's the urgency when they've known about this issue of these tritium drums, which are on Area G, which I showed a picture of. There are these 4 big drums that stored with tritium. There's a little space in the top of them for some gas that's accumulated that they say they need to vent to depressurize them so that they're safer for transport. And they've known about this issue for over 10 years. These are not the only drums full of tritium. And they're trying to push it through now in the middle of a pandemic when the pueblos are even shut down, you know, and when we don't need any more threats to our respiratory health or to our air. And there is other alternatives that have not been put on the table. And it's really frustrating because the regulators who permit this allowable harm to happen, like the Environmental Protection Agency, which is really environmental permitting agency, the New Mexico Environment Department, they have different jurisdictions of handling radioactive hazardous waste. And so this issue is being managed by people out in Texas, you know, and people out in California. And the state's environment department their hands are, you know, their department's severely underfunded. That department's slowly been being stripped through previous administrations over time to where now they don't even feel like they have the capacity to deal with this in a way that the community deserves of. So there's just so many systemic and structural problems that it's never been more apparent to me that we need to actively be voicing as a community the decommissioning of these sites and the shutdown of these labs, or transition to other endeavors and focusing on cleanup and restoration of these lands. the money's there. We've been talking about the issues of money. So there's no excuse for that. It's just, and it's not the necessity of cleanup of the health and well-being of our communities that drives cleanup at these labs, it's their budget. So if they only approve maybe 1 or 2% of their budget to clean up of our homelands, that's what they're going to do. It's not that they're concerned about our health. It's just all decided by these white men that are capitalists, that are military, and we're collateral damage. We're a sacrifice zone for this colonial government. You know, and we can go on and on about these issues, but what we really have to look at is the root cause of this kind of mindset and this value system that does not value the land or life or whatever it takes to continue these methods of for-profit war economy that we're forced to live in. And I call it economic slavery for our communities. You know, and we're fed a lot of lies and false narratives that these are good for us because they know we're not going to protest job creation. But we're finding now that our communities are even having to pay for these labs to be here. There's no economic benefits whatsoever to our peoples, you know, so there's just so much that we have to address. But like, you know, the public outcry has been really strong with this issue around tritium releases. And, you know, this is one of many issues. We're also facing increased pit production at the labs where they want to use their maximum capacity, which is I think up to 80 pits per year, which is the core of the nuclear bombs. Groups have fought that in the past to be about 25, and now they want to increase that to 30 and possibly 80. If that happens, and that's what happens when you're throwing billions of dollars, you're going to do whatever you can to do with it. There's roads being proposed over the river. There's increased housing. There's by the waste dump, you know, so we have to actively fight against this increased pit production, and we need a lot of support in that regard as well, and a lot of voices opposing that, because that's going to open the door for this uranium mining in other indigenous communities that's talked about, waste disposal, which is another issue in our state. And so we really just bear the brunt of a lot of this. And it's not even energy, it's weapons, you know, and so it's fighting that narrative that energy, nuclear energy is clean, green energy. That's false. It's going to negatively impact indigenous communities and land-based peoples. And then for sure, abolishing nuclear weapons, you know, has to be a constant goal, and we have to, I hope we can get there. And in the meantime, we're going to continue to practice our traditional ways of life. We're going to continue to pray for everybody, for life to continue in that loving and respecting and caring way, and whatever that looks like. So yeah, I hope that answered those questions, Cynthia.
Beata, that was profoundly moving, and again, devastating to listen to all of what's going on. And I just want to say that I've seen on your website, and we're putting into the chat right now, a really excellent action page of how we can support you. So I'm putting that into the chat for everyone now. That's about the radioactive release, and encouraging everyone to go to the Tewa Women United website to look at ways that we can actually bring what's happening there to a much wider audience, not only in our country, but in the world. And I want to thank you again. It was such an honor to have you with us sharing your story today. It's really informed us so much, and we must act to support you. So thank you.
And if I could add one more thing about the tritium that I didn't mention, is that it is in water form. And so it makes it really easy for it to get into our bloodstreams, into our food systems. And it's a little bit different than, you know, a radionuclide that doesn't have an easier, this has a really easy pathway into our bodies. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you for that. And again, this link that we're putting into the chat, it gives you more information about how to help with the tritium and other issues, supporting the work of Tewa Women United. Now would like to move to Ray. And Ray, I just want to begin by saying that you're giving your life to disarmament, and you really have done path-breaking work on the intersectionality of nuclear weapons, and really taken this thinking to a new level, and also on the feminist side of all of this. And so I'm so grateful for your scholarship and the depth that you've gone to in your work. And we're really so happy to have you with us today and honored. And I'm going to start with a question for you. So welcome again, Ray. I'm looking at you. I was struck by the statistic in your piece, The Pandemic of Nuclear Weapons, that we actually have more nuclear warheads in the United States than hospitals. And for me, this was a gut punch to really take this in because of the well over 200,000 deaths that we are facing now in the United States, and so many loved ones who were lost. So I'm just to begin by asking you the question, why do nuclear weapons matter more today than ever during this time of the global pandemic, the climate emergency, and Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And that statistic is pretty shocking. And when you couple it with the money that is spent, not just on nuclear weapons, which is about $50 billion a year, inching up to that. Projected spending for 2021 will be about $51.5 billion on the nuclear weapon complex. But then when you also work in the $736 billion a year on military and wars, plus around $50 billion a year for the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for ICE and Border Patrol, plus billions more on the CIA and on JSOC and all those so-called intelligence agencies that are also involved intimately in warfighting around the world, plus about $150 to $200 billion a year on policing and prisons in the United States. If you look at all that together, you get the answer to the question of why are nuclear weapons relevant in this moment. All of this is completely interconnected and interwoven with each other. All of this is militarism. It's all intimately related to the military mindset, the war profiteer system that Beata just talked about so well. This is a very patriarchal, very racist, very colonial military mindset that says that human beings need to be monitored and surveilled and controlled and categorized and incarcerated and killed. And that's what most of the world's population, that's the way they're looked at by this government, and not just the one that's currently in power here in this country, but the way that this country has operated for so many years. And we can look at how police brutality and mass incarceration and imperialist wars abroad are all part of the same system that enable nuclear weapons as well. I think it's really interesting when you start digging into the connections financially and at the corporate level of how all these systems are very physically intertwined as well. It's not just about the philosophy of militarism, but it's also very literally in terms of the same companies that are involved in building surveillance technologies and militarist technologies for the border wall and for the so-called protection of the borderlands are the same ones that are building nuclear bombs. They're the same ones that are also building war weapons that are used in wars that are then brought back to the United States for use by domestic police forces. So there's a very sort of literal physical manifestation of how all these systems are connected as well, and how our money goes into these systems and is used. And all of this works directly against what we actually need, which is care, things that prevent violence and harm, things like education and housing and food security, mitigation of the climate crisis, everything that we know would actually bring us safety and security is directly taken away from by the military industrial complex, by the nuclear weapon industrial complex, by this mindset of militarism and harm. And I always say that nuclear weapons are they're an often abstracted element of this whole system, because for so many people, they're out of sight and out of mind. Not for those that have experienced, that have the lived reality of the harm of these weapons, of course, but for so much of the global population, they don't think about these weapons. And yet they're really the leading edge of the violence that can be committed in a single act. They're the leading edge in terms of how they've really entrenched racist and colonial approaches to testing and use and development of weapon systems. They're intimately bound up with environmental degradation and would massively exacerbate climate change, like we've already heard this morning. So I think that when we think about what we're seeing right now in terms of the climate movement or movement for Black lives, to rights for migrants and asylum seekers, and protesting police brutality, and the ways in which the pandemic has cost lives and the climate crisis will, it's important to recognize how nuclear weapons are going to perpetuate all of these harms, but also the ways in which they can end all of our lives, or make the remaining life on the planet incredibly unbearable for those that may survive.
Thank you for that really whole systems look at this. It's really, really helpful. You've touched on a little bit of this in what you've just talked about, but the 9 nuclear armed states and their allies say that nuclear weapons are a necessary evil, that they keep us safe and are absolutely essential to our security. Why is this a myth? What is real security? And again, you've talked a little bit about that. And what role can a feminist foreign policy play in redefining security and building a secure and sustainable future for all?
Yeah, so it does fit into what I was just saying. And I think also referring back to what Molly said about the might makes right mentality as well of the international geopolitical system. And this idea that the best way to be secure is be able to commit or threaten to commit massive genocidal levels of violence. So that, is absurd to so many of us. It's, I think, very clear probably to most people on this call, certainly after all of the details that Beata has just given us, that nuclear weapons do not keep us safe. They have only ever caused harm. But this harm is completely discounted by the policy establishment elite because it's not harm to them. They actually profit from nuclear weapons. A lot of the think tanks that support nuclear weapons, as well as the government agencies, of course, a lot of them receive money from the nuclear weapon producing companies. They directly, physically, economically profit from perpetuating the myth of nuclear deterrence, for example, and they're not experiencing the effects of uranium mining or fallout from testing or radioactive waste. And so they can bury those as being irrelevant to the overall security strategy that they want to perpetuate. Deterrence is just a theory. I think that's really important to acknowledge, but in this country and in most of the nuclear armed states, it's treated as a gospel truth. Even from if you're in university as an undergraduate, you're given the classic arguments for and against deterrence. And it's just, there's a lot of evidence out there that says deterrence is a myth. But besides getting into that debate, which at the end of the day is about proving negatives, I think it's really important to look at the material reality of nuclear weapons, which exclusively gives us the reality of harm from the development, testing, use, and from the waste. So feminist understandings of power really help us pick through all this and recognize this. Feminism is about standing up to the dominant narrative, helping us sort through myths and challenge long-held suppositions about the way things are or how things work. So we only have to look at how nuclear weapons are talked about by their possessors to get a really good feel for a lot of the feminist analysis around nuclear weapons beyond what I've just said, but also the ways in which nuclear weapons are talked about. Molly touched on this a little bit in her presentation. If you're interested in this angle, Carol Cohn's work from the 1980s is really brilliant, digging into how nuclear war planners talked about nuclear weapons in such a masculinist, militarized way. But bringing that analysis up to date for what's been happening recently when we were negotiating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and reviving the humanitarian discourse, activists as well as diplomats from non-nuclear countries were told that we were being emotional and irrational for caring about what nuclear weapons do to human beings or the environment and for wanting to ban them. So the attachment to nuclear weapons from our perspective is actually what's irrational, but they've spun the narrative so tightly that they've tried to make everyone else look ridiculous and uninformed and non-expert, and they use jargoned language to try and elevate the eliteness of the conversation. And I ultimately think at the end of the day, it's, one day it's going to be obvious to the world that how this all played out. But right now it's up to feminists to kind of pick at these threads and point all of this out. And we're in a position to do that because that's what we have to do all the time with all the narratives that a certain segment of the male population has built.
Thank you, Ray. That was really helpful. So you talk about in changing narratives being a crucial part of changing minds, of overturning long-held beliefs of the way things have to be. And you talk about the deliberate shifting of mainstream consciousness that was crucial to the suffrage, civil rights, labor, and now LGBTQ plus rights movements for banning landmines, cluster bombs, smoking, and now nuclear weapons. What do you think is the one takeaway lesson that maybe you can share with us that you think would really be helpful as we move to change the mindset and abolish nuclear weapons? What is the one takeaway that you would say?
I'll try to do one. Maybe this is a two-part of one. Let's do it that way to fudge it a little. But I think one of the key things is really that we can learn from all of these movements is that what we're told is set in stone is not. What we're told is the natural order of things is not. What we're told about the possibilities of making change or progress is not necessarily true. That is based in a narrative, a dominant narrative and perception that is established by those in power, but that can always be challenged. And it doesn't mean that their reality, their notion of reality is actual reality. And so shifting this perception about what is possible is so important and so crucial, and all of these other movements have done this. And I think it's important to recognize here that possible doesn't mean likely. Hope doesn't mean a guarantee of something successfully working out. But what it means is that what we have right now is wrong, is harming human beings. It's not working. And if we work together, we can change it. So I think the sort of second part of this is that what these movements teach us is, in terms of making that shift, is also that the master's tools, to quote Audre Lorde, isn't going to work for us. We can't expect the change to come from within the institutions that oppress us. We have to force that change from the outside. So in the case of nuclear weapons, with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, this is exactly why we negotiated this treaty among non-nuclear armed states and the non-nuclear supportive states. And we were told this was a stupid idea. We're still being ridiculed for it. And there's people, the racist patriarchs from the government think tanks or other, elite NGOs that make fun of it. Whenever a small island state ratifies the treaty, they make fun of them on Twitter and saying, "Oh, I'm so happy that so-and-so isn't going to get nuclear weapons, ha, ha, ha." And it's just, they don't get it. And that's okay. History will bear this out. But we made international law, diplomats and activists that reject nuclear weapons, made binding international law that outlaws nuclear weapons, and it's about to enter into force. Literally at any minute, we're going to get the 50th ratification. I'm glued to my phone all day and all night because it's coming in at any moment now. And it's already having a massive impact on economics and debates, and I'll talk about that a little later on. And it's going to have an impact on possession, and that's what these movements also teach us, which is that nothing is immediate. You know, there's this pushback to the Prohibition Treaty of people saying, oh, it's not going to eliminate a single nuclear weapon. Well, not tomorrow. You know, this is a long-term game. We take a step forward, you get pushed back by oppositional and conservative forces, you get pushed around, then you make more gains. It's an ongoing struggle. There's no one victory that solves the problem completely. And we can see that from every movement in history. It takes generations of persistent and relentless activism. So what these movements really teach us is just not to give up.
That's great. Thank you. We're not going to give up. Thank you. You've gotten a little bit into the next couple of questions on the treaty, but, you know, can you talk about your work on the treaty? You played a leading role with ICANN in that treaty, and that it really, and you touched on this already, but that it evolved into a treaty based on humanitarian law, representing the interests of those most disproportionately affected, and that also the interests of the unarmed nuclear states. And as it comes now about to be coming into force, you know, what you think the pathway forward is with the nuclear armed states. Where do we go from here? I just learned very early this morning about the 2 countries that ratified yesterday, and now we're down to just one country. And I know that there were reports this week that the US is asking countries to pull out who have ratified. So if you could kind of bring this all together, maybe, since you've already started talking about it, it'd be really helpful for us. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So first on my work for the treaty, yeah, that's been going on since around 2010, I guess, is really when ICANN started promoting the idea of a treaty banning nuclear weapons, even without the nuclear armed states. And it was a really controversial idea at first. There was a handful of governments that were quietly supportive of this, mostly ones who had been active in banning landmines and cluster bombs and sort of knew how humanitarian disarmament worked and the impacts it could have. But even within the activist community, there was a lot of pushback to the idea of doing something without the nuclear armed states. So a lot of the early work was on kind of reconciling people's minds with this idea as something that might be possible, and then working to advance these conversations through the revival of the discourse on the humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons, which of course were very vibrant in the 1960s and the 1980s, but really educating a new generation of diplomats working on this issue, as well as activists, and bringing them together as a vehicle to move towards political and legal solutions like the ban. A lot of the work was working with diplomats within regions and across regions, attending so many meetings over many, many years, building up knowledge, but also building up community of the actors involved, because we needed to be able to trust each other, knowing that the pressure from the nuclear armed states would be overwhelming. It involved advocacy, analysis at the UN, challenging the nuclear armed narrative, and eventually, once we got negotiations underway, directly shaping what was in the treaty, which was a really, really great experience. We didn't just leave it, you know, all up to the governments once they started negotiating. We were actually involved as activists in the content of the treaty. Yeah, so the treaty is the first one that has been negotiated since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. So it had been a very long time since there'd been any new nuclear weapon law negotiated. It's the first nuclear weapon treaty to recognize the gendered impacts of nuclear weapons, the first to recognize the humanitarian and environmental impacts and the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous people. It's the first to recognize the suffering of the hibakusha, the survivors from Japan. And it's the first to include environmental remediation and victim assistance as obligations in the treaty. And it's the first to categorically outlaw the possession, development, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. So it's a historic treaty for many, many, many reasons. And I think that it's, you know, the effect it will have is going to shift over time in terms of, and how it will affect different states differently. So once it's in force, which will happen in 90 days after we get the 50th ratification, it will become binding on all states, parties, and signatories. And then there will be a meeting of states parties within the next year to deal with some of the questions that were left open-ended in the treaty, like the deadline for disarmament for any joining nuclear armed state and things like that. But it's also going to have an impact on countries that don't join, which we've seen with landmines in particular, where, you know, even the United States has stopped building and selling landmines and stopped using them in conflict, except for the DMZ between North and South Korea. And we've seen in the US also the last producer of cluster munitions ended its production. So we can see the ways in which the normative effects of these types of humanitarian disarmament treaties will have a real economic impact. Divestment is already happening. Massive pension funds and banks around the world, including in non-supportive countries, are already pulling their money out from nuclear weapon producers, and they're citing the treaty in doing so. So we'll see a lot more of that once the treaty's in force. We're seeing it already impact debates. There's been a lot of parliamentary action in many countries, particularly in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries, so NATO. And we just had a letter published of over 50 former officials from NATO countries, former prime ministers, foreign ministers, et cetera, say that their countries should join the TPNW, which was quite remarkable because we also, amongst all the other things we've been told that we did wrong, we were told that NATO states would also never join. And it's just interesting to see those debates internally. So of course, the pressure to not join is there. You mentioned this recent phenomenon with the US, which absolutely has been quite remarkable, and as far as we know, unprecedented. But the US sent a letter to everyone that has ratified the treaty saying that they made a mistake and telling them to withdraw their instrument of ratification, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean, okay, this particular US government does not like international law, we know that. So it's not that surprising that it would call on other countries to withdraw from treaties. But the idea of saying that, you know, what in some cases are years-long legislative processes that these countries go through are a strategic error, or that they didn't understand what it was that they were signing up to. It's just so incredibly patriarchal, racist, because most of these countries are countries of the global South that have done this, and the idea that they just don't understand what they did, and or that the United States wouldn't like it and they didn't realize that, you know, it's just absolutely mind-boggling behavior. But they've been under pressure the whole time to not support negotiations, to not join the treaty, and now to withdraw from the treaty. So it's really amazing to see the ways in which these countries are standing up for what's right and what they have committed to. And I think that will have an impact on international relations in ways we can't yet foresee. But it's really a great example and very hopeful example of the majority of the world coming together to stand up to the most powerful countries and say, we're not doing it your way anymore. We're doing it our own way.
It's really a very exciting time for this. I mean, with all the work that you've done, I'm sure this moment must be really, really amazing for you. I know you say the work isn't done, that it's really probably just getting started, but it's really wonderful. Can you talk about now, as we close with you, how women can get involved in supporting your mission at Critical Will, and what is the one most important thing we could start to do for the treaty right now today, and what you recommend for people here? How can we actually support this in moving forward?
So I think how you can best support really depends on what country you're in. I think most people on this call are probably in the United States, in which case working at the city level to raise the debate around nuclear weapons and to get your city council to urge the government to join the treaty and to also adopt divestment legislation. So here in New York City, for example, we've been working with New York City Council to withdraw all of the city's pension funds from nuclear weapon producing companies. There's an ICANN cities appeal that you can get involved in, and a lot of major U.S. cities have already joined that, and that's ongoing in all of the nuclear armed states and the NATO states as well, and other countries that don't yet support the treaty. If you're in one of those countries, a NATO state or an umbrella state like Australia, working on getting them to join the treaty by doing advocacy with parliamentarians or officials that aren't from the ruling party to support the treaty, to get debates going, op-eds and actions. That's really important. In Australia, they climbed up on the roof of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a banner drop. In Germany and the Netherlands, they go do sit-ins at the bases where the US stores its nuclear weapons. So there's lots of those types of activities that you can do. And if you're a student at a university that has a relationship with a nuclear weapon lab or a company that makes bombs, you can get your university to withdraw from those. So there's ICANN resources on that as well. So I think all of those are kind of concrete actions. And I think the main thing that we can all do is really just in our conversations with ourselves and with our friends and families is to talk about possibilities and change and the ways that nuclear weapons relate to what we're seeing right now politically in this country and around the world.
Thank you for those really concrete action plans. And also this is a beautiful lead into our next speaker, who's Colleen, who's going to talk to us about how we talk to our families and friends and people we work with about nuclear weapons. So Ray, thank you so much this was so rich, and we're all standing by with you, checking on when the 50th country is going to ratify. So blessings, and thank you for all your incredible work on the treaty and everything else. Colleen, how do we talk about nuclear weapons? This is such a critical part of our work, and we're blessed really to have you with us today because you're a truly gifted expert. You work on this every day in person, on Twitter, on Instagram. And so I want to begin with you by just circling back to something personal, which is you've given so much of your life. Welcome. Can't see you. There you are. Welcome. You've given so much of your life to so many conflicts in the world. Why are you working on nuclear weapons of all these other ones that are so important, but this one, why have you chosen this one with all these other ones that you care about, and why do they matter more than ever? And then maybe you can get us into how you talk about them, how you talk about nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. And it's been so inspiring to hear all of the other mentors talk about intersectionality and really centering humans and their work. And that's so inspiring to hear. And that's very much why I chose to work on this issue as well. So conversations of national security, especially in the US, but I'm sure elsewhere as well, they're so wonky. They're so like problem focused, and it's so disconnected from everyday experiences and very much not centered around human beings and who and why we're actually doing this work. So I really felt an opportunity when I saw this opportunity to work at Global Zero and Beyond the Bomb. And Global Zero is the global movement to eliminate nuclear weapons. And Beyond the Bomb is their US grassroots sister organization, specifically in the US. And I really saw an opportunity to utilize my skills of not only knowing some of these national security issues a little bit more in depth, but also just being able to talk to normal people about their everyday experiences and how it relates to the nuclear system. And having those advocacy and communication skills of communicating to various audiences about these issues and ultimately galvanizing them to take action and really bridging that gap between like the policy wonks and what they're doing is really, really important, but also connecting that to grassroots activism. And I do think nuclear weapons are the greatest dangers of our time, and it matters today more than ever. And mostly deferring back to what all of the other presenters have talked about today, it relates to so many fights around the world. And I think Ray put it really eloquently of like all of these systems are so interconnected. And then also going back to what Molly said, like at Beyond the Bomb, we refer to nuclear weapons as issue zero. So if a nuclear exchange were to happen, our work on social justice issues would essentially end. Like we wouldn't be able to work on these other issues if what we're focusing on is that a nuclear exchange just happened. So whatever you care about, if you're working to end, if you're working to roll back the effects of climate change, if you're working to end conflicts around the world, we wouldn't be able to do that anymore because all of our focus would be diverted to this awful catastrophe. So yeah, you also mentioned just like talking about nuclear weapons, and especially in a way that really gets people to care and to act. So I'm just gonna share some slides just very briefly, just few slides just to kind of start this conversation. So really how to talk about nuclear weapons. And these are kind of like 6 ways I've kind of outlined of trying to start to talk about these issues. And I'll get a little bit more in depth a little bit later. But like I said, when I first started, we really need to get past like analysis of the problem. People tend to associate threats like nuclear weapons with their inherent dangers, which absolutely makes sense, but they also need to associate these dangers with solutions and with ways forward. So we need to go beyond describing the problem and explaining why our issue is important, and go beyond that and explain why it is important, but also how solutions can improve those outcomes. So I see a lot of like problem-based messaging out there. I mean, we absolutely need to kind of start with that, but we also need to go beyond that and focus mostly on solutions, because people need to be able to see this issue as urgent, as solvable. People will just shut down if they just continue to hear about the negative side of things. I know when I was growing up, and really the only things I was learning in the American education system was like briefly about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and really from the perspective that like, you know, this was the only way to end World War II, which I know now, obviously, that was not the correct choice. And we never really heard about the human side of it. But I just thought of this as this like gigantic problem that I'm like, I don't even know where I'm supposed to begin. I don't think I have any agency in actually moving this issue towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So people will begin to shut down if they just continue to hear this about this like huge solvable problem. That's kind of the first part, is getting past the problem to the solution. Knowing your audience. As a communications professional, I always talk about this of you have to know who you're talking to, who you're trying to move to take action. So depending on your audience, like communicating with, say, like a Democratic member of Congress or member of Parliament is very different than communicating with like a more conservative member of Parliament or Congress, or communicating with an activist, or communicating with the media. You know, I might use like the guns for butter argument depending on who I'm talking to, of absolutely like everything we've talked about today, of like, look at the amount of money we're spending on the Pentagon and on weapons of mass destruction while we're going through a pandemic, and we claim to not have enough money for universal health care and for hospitals and for quality, accessible care for everybody. So I might use that argument with like a certain subset of people. But maybe some other, like a Republican member of Congress, I might kind of dive into a little bit more of like, what do they really care about? Like, do they say on their website that they're like really passionate about like veterans healthcare? I would use that argument of like, well, if we didn't spend this much money on these weapons of mass destruction, we would have more resources to, and we absolutely do have enough resources to take care of our veterans more. So it's really knowing your audience, then figuring out how that messaging differs between those audiences. Like, who are we trying to talk to? What do we want them to do? What do they value? How are we reaching them? And kind of like I was saying, like what motivates them, who influences them, what issues do they stand for? So it's really diving into who you're trying to move on this issue and how to talk to them and really how to meet them where they're at. And I'll talk a little bit more about like the proximity aspect too. The third aspect is using humor and lightening up a little bit. And there's like a certain way to do this without, you know, being inappropriate, and really doing it at the right time and with the right resources. Like I know Beyond the Bombs social media audience loves different like satirical pieces, you know, depending like, you know, the Onion articles, but there is a way to illuminate this dark topic by conveying its importance, by also offering some lighthearted, some dark comedy to really get this point across. And I think that also goes back to knowing your audience, like what kind of media outlets do they really follow? What kind of outlets or what kind of social media platforms are they on? Also on audience, like, so the different social media platforms are so important to look at as well. Like, if I am trying to communicate with a younger audience, and that's definitely what Beyond the Bomb is trying to do, is communicate with these like young, really engaged activists that may not know too much about nuclear weapons, maybe like marginally engaged. Like I might try to connect with them through something like TikTok or Instagram, because something like Facebook tends to skew older. So it's looking at like, who are you trying to talk to and how are you reaching them? And sometimes humor and lightening up can definitely be the way to do that. Connecting with emotions, that's so important, and I can talk about that a little bit more later as well. But it's really about referencing those tangible human consequences and showing, not telling. Like I think the Anointed poem and video that we watched earlier in this session, like that was so powerful because we were hearing about the tangible experiences. We weren't telling people like, this is bad, these are the facts, these are the numbers. This was a personal experience. And that tends to connect with people even more so than giving these facts and figures. And then making it proximate, making it intersectional, everything we've talked about today with the past mentors that have talked about this, connecting it to everyday experiences of your audience. And the last part of this is shifting from awareness to action. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about this. So we want to, like, people will start at this first stage of like that it's a threat. So it's the starting place of a belief, the belief that a statement is true, and it doesn't always require exhaustive details and history. It's just like one memorable argument, one memorable experience. We want to elevate them to become concerned. So a threat is elevated by a sense of urgency to a concern, which is something that your audience thinks about over and over again because it begins to matter to them and their community. Like they see that this is something that they need to protect their friends, their family, their community from. And then it's elevating that to a cause when it's shared with others in conversation or over social media, once your audience has the confidence to own that message. And then progress, that's when they ultimately take action. So that's sustained through progress through a goal, appreciation from a community, and personal validation. And then how do we actually do this? And I kind of broke this down into, like, this isn't exhaustive at all, but really how to do this, the kind of 4 buckets. Focus on community, that's like exactly what I just said. Focusing on community is a lot more effective than making this like a personal issue or a global issue. Like I said, like we don't want this to be such a gigantic problem that we shut down and we think that we can't do anything about it. But when it becomes a community problem, like I said, like it taps into people's collective desire to protect those that we care about. connecting through cultural relevance. So it kind of goes back to knowing your audience. Like, what kind of culturally relevant voices should we be sharing these ideas and solutions with? I know that When Without War, for example, they work a lot with Mark Ruffalo, who really cares about ending the conflict in Yemen. So they do a lot of videos with him, and you'll see on his social media feed like videos of him talking about ending the war in Yemen, and especially US support for it. And so that speaks to his audience, maybe people who never would have known about the war in Yemen before. And I think that could really, and I think a lot of people and organizations in our community have done that as well. Like, I know George Takei did a video with the Union of Concerned Scientists talking about the 75th anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we can always get like a Mark Ruffalo or a George Takei. I know that's tough to do, but just thinking through of like, who is out there that has different audiences that maybe we want to shift from awareness to action, and how can we maybe access that and get them to share our ideas and solutions as well. Keeping it ownable, keeping the message simple, relatable, repeatable. Your audience can't own a message if they're struggling to retell it or fit into a conversation. So keeping it simple, keeping it really straightforward, and then ultimately invoking hope. I think that's what we've been talking a lot about today. If we are just talking about like our assured demise, that's going to fuel resignation, and it's not going to activate innovation or protest or change. We want to, like, we absolutely want to focus on that problem, but we want people to know this issue as something that is solvable, as something that we can change. Like, we can eliminate nuclear weapons in our time. And like Global Zero, for example, has a plan for that. Beyond the Bomb has very concrete ways to get involved in the US. So I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, I hope that was a good overview of kind of how we can shift from awareness to action of talking about nuclear weapons.
Colleen, that was really helpful, really actually brilliant for me. It just putting it all together that way, and really systematically showing how we can talk to our families, our friends, and how to make it relevant, all the options that we have, and focusing on the solutions rather than just the problem, and making it personal, which seems to be a way to connect with people. So that was really helpful, really, really helpful. Can you talk to us now about how people can get involved with the work that you're doing, and how people can get involved with Beyond the Bomb and help you spread the word, and maybe some of what you're doing on social media? Just let us know how if we want to really work with you or collaborate with you or be in touch with you, how we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll drop my email in the chat, so feel free, anybody, to email me. But the main campaign for Beyond the Bomb that we're working on right now is galvanizing support for no first use, specifically in the United States. So I have dropped in the link earlier, but I'll put it in again, of a link to all of the ways you can learn about no first use and the fight for it in the US. And there's also an option to get on our email list, and you can write or call your representative and your other elected officials to talk about why no first use is really key to work on right now. And especially with the election coming up, we're doing an endorsement campaign where we have over 60 candidates for Congress that have endorsed no first use, meaning that if they are elected, they will work to pass no first use. And there is a bill in Congress right now. It's 921 in the House, and forgetting the number of the Senate bill, but there's also a corresponding Senate bill that Senator Warren has put forth a few years ago. And there is really great support for this, and we're hoping that this election will put these issues even more in the spotlight. So I dropped that link in the chat so you can get plugged in on social media. I also work for Global Zero as well, and you can also get on our email list and support no first use on our website in that link that I just dropped in. And Global Zero is like I said, it's more of a global movement than Beyond the Bomb. So we're working on global no first use, starting with the US, but also working in tandem with other nuclear armed countries. And another one of our big campaigns right now is extending New Start. because it does expire in February 2021, and it's the last, really the last nuclear arms control treaty that is left between the US and Russia, and really the only thing that's left that's really containing a full-out nuclear arms race. There's kind of a lot of back and forth happening right now between the US and Russia about its extension. And it's the US isn't super keen on extending it right now, but we're working, and we're trying to ensure that this last kind of linchpin of nuclear arms control isn't lost. So if you want to learn a little bit more about what Global Zero is doing on extending New START and no first use, definitely get on our email list. I can also drop in the link to our Twitter and other social media pages, but definitely email me. I'm always happy to collaborate, and Molly talked a little bit about our fellows program with Beyond the Bomb, but really with Beyond the Bomb, like there's so many different ways to get plugged in on our website. There's a lot of different campaigns where you can write your representative or call your representative, sign petitions, start the conversation on social media. A lot of these also have kind of some social media toolkits and ways to like click to tweet at your representative, or really just talking about what Beyond the Bomb does. So there's so many ways to get involved. Definitely email me, and I'll drop my email in the chat.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for all of that really helpful information and for giving us all these concrete things that we can do to work with you. It's really, really wonderful. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom. And I just want to say that we're a little bit over time, so we're going to just close the session now for those who need to leave, but those who can stay, we're going to have an extended Q&A that will go until a half an hour from now, until where I am in Hawaii, 9:30. And Pacific time, that would be 12:30. So just to honor those who, I want to first honor all the mentors for sharing your incredible wisdom, insight, and experience. Some of you I know can join us for this extended Q&A. And so would love for those who can to stay with us. And I'd also really like to thank all of you for coming today, joining us from these many places around the world as we come together to claim our seats at the table to transform our nuclear legacy and eliminate nuclear weapons. And I just also want to say that all the mentors are really inviting you to join them and collaborate with them and support them. Their names are on there, and their contacts and their resources are all on our website, things they've offered, articles to go deeper on their work, TED Talks, etc. So please visit the links that we're putting in the chat. You'll be getting those in emails as well. And our next session will be Saturday, November 14th. The theme will be Storytelling for Change, Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy. And we'll be hearing from women who are really working with story, some of what we heard today, to inspire people to wake up and take action to eliminate nuclear weapons. I want to thank Tom Dawson for managing the Zoom session so beautifully. And we will now go into the Q&A for those who can stay. And Kumu, Hula, Puna, Dawson will be doing the closing blessing at the end. She's graciously just said that she can stay, and we'll be doing the closing blessing for our gathering at 9:30 Hawaii time, which is 12:30 Pacific time. So with that, I'd like to move to the Q&A for those who can stay. And let's see, I just want to invite those who have questions now to come forward. If you have a question, please click on the icon participants at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of the right window, then you'll see you can click the button labeled raised hand. And when you are called on, please unmute yourself to answer. And if you could please try to keep your questions brief so that more people can participate. And it would be wonderful if you could let us know when you start speaking where you're actually speaking from, where you are on the planet, joining us from today. So let's move to the Q&A now. Thank you all so much for coming. Any questions? Mary Olson, welcome back. Mary's our mentor from the first session, one of our mentors from the first session, who does incredible work on the disproportionate impact of radiation on women and girls, and that made it into the treaty. So welcome, Mary.
Thanks, Cynthia. I just briefly want to say woohoo for the treaty. And we have a habit in our communities of not celebrating intermediate goals. And this is such a huge one that I just want to invoke the idea that we have, when we have 50 parties, states parties, we are all going to party, even in stay home, stay safe. We are going to put on our favorite music. We're going to put on our favorite clothes. We're going to put on wonderful drinks and food, and we are going to party. And thank you, Ray, and thank you, everybody else, because we need this and we need to celebrate in great joy.
Woohoo, back to you. I love that idea. Let's party. That's going to happen pretty soon. Ray, calling on you. Actually, Mary, since you're here, I know that there was Sarah Hine from the last session had a question on nuclear waste, and you had to leave early. So Sarah, if you could come forward to ask your question, it's very relevant to the conversation that we've been having today with Beata, and also what we saw with Kathy's piece from the Marshall Islands. Sarah, if you're still here, do you want to come forward to ask your question?
Hi, I am. I'm not sure how to get my video on. Do I need it? Oh, there we go. Hi. I just wanted to know, once the nuclear weapons are disarmed, what happens to that nuclear waste? Is it able to be completely eradicated, or does it just sit somewhere forever?
Thank you for asking that question. And I'm going to talk about what we know about today, acknowledging that we may someday know something different about radioactivity and elements and how all this works. But when human beings split atoms or concentrate atoms from natural deposits, we end up with stuff that's not natural on our planet. And when a large atom is split, a plutonium or uranium nucleus is split, millions of times more radioactivity. Radioactivity is the actual particles coming out. So when we talk about highly radioactive, we're not actually talking about uranium and plutonium, which are very slow emitters. They're deadly. I'm not dismissing their harm in any way, shape, or form, and their ability to do harm to our planet in the form of weapons when they're concentrated. But in fact, what you get out from using them in reactors is millions of times more radioactivity in those particles and waves coming out that can cause that much more health consequences. And those health consequences from cesium and strontium go on. They're the main bad actors, but there's a whole alphabet soup, go on for 10 to 20 half-lives. So even though they're shorter, 30 years as opposed to 30,000 years, I'm just pulling numbers here, but 24,000 years for plutonium-239, 1 half-life, that's very slow. Cesium, strontium, 30 years, much faster, but it takes 10 or 20. So is 300 years short to make millions of times more radioactivity that's that much more cancer causing, that much more harmful to our reproduction, to all life's reproduction for 300 years, as opposed to saying, hey, we have to contain this stuff, we have to grow up, we have to stop wanting to make these weapons of mass destruction, we have to make new decisions, because isolation really is the goal, right? Because we're going to have it either way, either many more times of the disintegrations per second and minute in cesium and strontium because we fissioned it, or we still have the uranium that came with our planet and we have the plutonium that we've since produced. Either way, we have to contain it. And the last thing I'm going to say is that unfortunately, our governments think that controlled release is the answer. All of the regulatory bodies allow allowable release. Our friend from New Mexico, Beata, mentioned that allowable release. This is the regulatory structure for radioactivity today. And part of the work I want to do is to say, hey, wait a second. It's all based on the wrong thing. It's based on the adult male who is the most resistant to radiation, and it's based on release instead of containment. So let's base it on the part of our life cycle that's most vulnerable. And we know that's in reproduction, but in terms of populations, then young females below the age of 10. If we based as a first change, a first step, our regulations on protecting her, it would protect everyone better. And we would stop the idea of release and start the idea of containment, isolation, shielding, and stopping the production of any more. If you have to keep track of it all, it becomes obvious you have to stop making it. So that's kind of the thought process of a lot of people who've been working on this. So no, it doesn't go away. And no, splitting it doesn't make it better.
Can I ask one more question pertaining to that? What about the thing with Fukushima right now that they're talking about dumping the contaminated water into the ocean?
Not containment, not isolation, totally about release.
Yeah.
And they are assuming that the Pacific is big enough to take it, which we saw that it's been difficult to have the conversation about this. It's misrepresented often, but there are currents that are very specific across the Pacific that carry waters from Japan expressly to North America. And so it's kind of weird to have the idea that it's going to be equally distributed through this whole ocean, when in fact we know there are these currents that carry many things, including radioactivity.
Right.
So do I know how much threat it is to people at this end? No, I can't quantify that. I don't have enough data. And quite frankly, no one has enough data, which is very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh.
Cynthia, we can't hear you.
Martha Mariana Mendoza, I see your hand is raised. Please unmute yourself. Welcome.
Well, no, hi, thank you very much to everybody for the wonderful presentations and all the personal stories that you shared with us today. I think it's very, very inspiring. And it's been wonderful. It's the first time that I joined the seminar, and I'm really, really thankful with everybody. Now regarding my question, I have a question, I think for Ray. Well, I will be celebrating also the 50th ratification as soon as we get the news on that. But I would like to know if you have any, I don't want to say prediction, but how do you think that this is going to affect the NPT review conference? I mean, it's going to be, the ban treaty is going to enter into force before that happens. And I think that is changing completely the conversation and the review process that has been being prepared by the states during these 5 years. How do you think that that's going to switch the conversations and probably the outcomes of the conference? And how could that affect or have an impact from the feminist perspective on this deterrence approach and the security concept based on what was discussed before, masculinity and deterrence and force and everything? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you very much. In terms of the ban's impact on the review conference, so right now the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is scheduled for January. It was postponed from last April, May, but it will likely be postponed again. because obviously restrictions are not such that states can meet as they normally would in person in the numbers that they want to. So we don't have confirmation on when the review conference will be at this point. But I see there's a few things to raise in the context of the NPT. One is that the nuclear armed states have, of course, accused the ban treaty and its proponents of undermining the non-proliferation treaty, which is completely absurd because prohibiting nuclear weapons and having states sign up to restrictions that are much tighter than what are in the non-proliferation treaty can't undermine the non-proliferation treaty. So it's a fallacious argument on its face, but they're just looking for someone to blame for the challenges that the NPT faces, which those challenges entirely rest with the 5 nuclear armed states that are party to that treaty. Their modernization of nuclear weapons, their failure to implement their Article 6 obligations to disarm, and their inability to deal with other related commitments like negotiating the fissile material treaty or the entry into force of the test ban treaty. I think also Colleen had mentioned the extension of New START. I think that whether or not that treaty is extended will have a much bigger impact on what kind of outcome we can get at the NPT than the ban treaty will, because at the end of the day, the challenges that have been mounting with the non-proliferation treaty are all bound up in the nuclear armed states aggressively violating the provisions of that treaty when it comes to disarmament. So that's sort of where I'm looking to see what we can get out of the review conference. Also, the election here might have an impact, of course, on what might be possible at the review conference, which also, is another reason why it might be good if the RevCon is postponed beyond January. So, there's a lot of factors at play. At the end of the day, though, all of the states that champion the ban treaty and that have signed and ratified it are also NPT states parties, and they're also very committed to that treaty. And they've always said that this agreement completely complements the NPT. So I think we're not going to see any change in the ways that they engage at the NPT. I think they'll be pushing, of course, for strong commitments on nuclear disarmament, but they always do that. And then in terms of the impacts of the ban on feminist discourse, I think it's already advanced a lot of that. It was really interesting during the negotiation, the example that I gave of diplomats being told they were emotional for wanting to ban nuclear weapons. I mean, it was really interesting to go through that and have that be kind of a light bulb moment for several diplomatic colleagues working on this, as suddenly these sort of discussions around gendered norms and expectations and discourse really hit home for them in a way that it had been kind of abstract before. So I think that there's more and more opportunities to really bring that perspective to bear on nuclear weapons discourse through the treaty's entry into force and then its implementation. That's always going to be part of the conversation, as well as everything related to the impact on Indigenous communities and environmental remediation and victim assistance, that all of these new things we have not had before in international treaty law to deal with nuclear weapons. So I think there's lots of opportunities to change the mainstream narrative around nuclear weapons through this process.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Martha, for that question. And we go to Elizabeth Christine. You have your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, I have a question for Beata concerning the tritium release. I've been really curious, and you referred to the fact that there are other ways that they can deal with this waste than releasing it into the atmosphere. And I would just like to hear more about that. What the alternatives are.
So I know there's a way to capture and recycle the tritium. I think right now it's in just a little trailer on top of the mesa that they're going to be releasing it. So I think it is possible to build a containment. I think it's possible to store these drums for 15 more years to when the tritium is no longer as harmful and it's like it does have a short when it starts to break down to where it's less harmful when releasing it into the environment. So I think there's ways to store it in a contained facility, or even to just build a structure around it. In my mind, I don't know how plausible that is, but till it's no longer so harmful to be released into the environment. And yeah, I'd like to see these alternatives in writing and on paper. You know, when they did go to get permissions from EPA Region 6, there wasn't any alternatives listed. So I think they need to backtrack and show us these other alternatives or ways to deal with this waste that we haven't discussed in depth as a community or as impacted communities.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Beata. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Elizabeth. We have Laura Feldman. Would you like to come forward with your question? You want to unmute yourself?
Hi there. This is sort of tagging on to Mary's comment a little bit earlier. One of the things that I think we can do right now is to be clear about the narrative that's being spun. For instance, you know, holding the Olympics at Fukushima, it's a way of normalizing something that can't be normal. Here I live in Portland, Oregon, downriver from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. And, you know, turning the B reactor into, you know, a park, part of the national parks, the famous B reactor, and having people come and visit it, along with what's going on there in terms of reclassifying high-level waste and grouting them in place. Rocky Flats, turning it into a wildlife preserve. I mean, it's really insidious, and I think part of what we can really do is to be very mindful about what's happening, tell the stories, know what's buried where, and continue to put that forward. Otherwise, you know, they'll be serving it to us for breakfast, honestly. Just a thought.
Laura, thank you for that really important comment about changing the narratives, which different people today, Ray and others spoke about, Colleen. It's really, and Beata, everybody really touched on this today, Molly. It seems to be a core part of this work is not accepting the myths and the lies and not making it nice, which is what the Olympics in Japan would do. So thank you for that. Is there anyone else who would like to come forward now for a question for one of our mentors? I also want to say that we have mentors from the last session still with us. We've got Natalia Zhurina with us. If anyone was interested in talking with her, she's a disarmament professional. She's Russian, works now for OpenAll, the nonproliferation organization in Mexico City. And I also just want to say that she has had this wonderful idea to organize a WhatsApp group for women transforming our nuclear legacy. So we'll put the link in the chat to that as well. But it's a way for us to stay in touch with each other between sessions, for us to really collaborate, weave new connections with one another, especially because we're an international group. A lot of us are in the United States, but we have, I think, at least 21 countries represented, at least as of registration this morning. So it's a great way to stay in touch. Natalia and I are texting each other pretty constantly on WhatsApp, and it's really great because it's free. And so I just want to offer that to the group as a way to go deeper with one another between sessions. So any other questions for any of the mentors today, or Mary, who's still with us from the last session, or Natalia? Jessica Slade is also still here, Global Zero nuclear expert. And I'm just looking to see who else is still here, but I see we have a number of women from Russia, so and other places. So we have an opportunity for another maybe 2 or 3 minutes before Puna comes in to do the closing blessing. If anyone has a question they'd like to bring forward or a comment. Let's see if there's anybody in the chat. Okay. Well, thank you all again for coming, and again to the mentors for your unbelievably profound sharing of your wisdom and insight. And again, we have the next session on November 14th. We'll be in touch with you on email between now and then. And if you haven't voted yet, I would invite everyone to please vote. We need to bring into elected office people we can hold accountable on nuclear weapons who will respond to us, and people who will join us as we claim our seat at the table to eliminate nuclear weapons. It's absolutely existential that we elect people into office here and all over the world who will join us in this effort. And now that the treaty is coming into force, it's so important. So at this point, I'd like to invite, if there aren't any more questions, Auntie Puna to come back and to close this circle of people who have joined us today for Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy. We welcome you back to give us a blessing.
Aloha, mahalo to all of you. It is such an honor, a continued honor, to hear the voices and to hear the hope, and most especially the concerns. I wanted my granddaughter to be able to hear your voice, because in your voice is the breath. And so your ancestral history comes through that voice. I ask all of you to put your hands together right in front of you. Breathe into it. Breathe into those hands. That's your ha. Yeah. Breathe into those hands and lift them up, because now we're one world with one breath, with one intention, and that intention of peace. We say aloha, but we're really saying, come share our breath, come share our intention, come share our peace. In that word Hawaii, that birth waters that we all come from, our mothers, we all come from the birth waters of our mothers. And Ionalani, in that word Hawaii, is that universal understanding of pono. And pono is to be in accordance to the earth, the gifts of the earth, and God. So when we say Hawaii, which all of you are a part of, one breath, one intention, one aloha. Thank you for this time sharing your breath, sharing your intention, and continuing to do the work that we all have opportunity to be a part of. A simple smile, even though we have to wear masks, but a simple smile may be the joy when you encounter other people that bring them to life or bring them to that moment. So I offer this aloha, lift it up, and continue to send blessings around the world. Mahalo, aloha, blessings to everyone. Ahui ho.
Mahalo, Auntie Puna. Ahui ho. Aloha. Blessings. Thank you, everyone, for coming. See you next month.